I want to talk about a few very practical ideas for improving sports journalism, and if I were even more pretentious than I am, I'd call it a manifesto. But really, it's just some ideas to make it a bit better. And I want to start with the one great advantage that we have over other kinds of journalism, like business journalism, political journalism, or health journalism, which is that in sport, you can see what's happening in front of your own eyes. The players are performing on the pitch in front of us, and we can see who is good and who isn't, unless, of course, they're match fixing. Generally, though, in sport, what you see is what you get. We all think that Messi and Rooney are great players, and you know what? They really are great players. There's no secrets. In business journalism, as I know to my cost as a former business journalist, you get companies like Enron, companies that people think are brilliant companies, and then they turn out to be duds. Well, you don't really get that in sport. There are no duds in sports who can fool everyone for a while. Every now and then a dud pops up, like when Liverpool bought Jimmy Traore a few years ago. But within a couple of weeks, the fans, the media, and the club itself realise the guy's a dud and he gets shipped out. So sports journalism has this fundamental accuracy that you don't find in other forms of journalism. And I realised this when I teamed up with Stefan Szymanski, who's a sports economist, and we wrote a book together called Soccernomics. And what had bothered me when fans or journalists talk about sport is when it began to sound, as it very often does, like drunks in the bar, where everybody's shouting out an opinion and nobody actually has any data. And that's why it was a joy to me to meet Stefan. It was fascinating, because the guy actually had data. I mean, this is possibly too small for you to see. But what it shows in that upward sloping graph is the correlation between how much a club spends on players' salaries and how well it performs over time. And what you see in the English top two divisions from 1998 to 2007 is the correlation over that 9-year period between what a club spends on salaries over the 9 years and where it finishes in the league is 89%. In Italy, Stefan did a similar exercise for 1987 through 2001, and even though the Italians were match fixing a few games, the correlation there was even better. In Italy, the link between salaries and a club's performance over those 14 years averaged out was 93%. In other words, salaries of players explain almost everything in soccer. The team that pays most finishes top, the team that pays least finishes bottom is the general rule. Now, it's true that over one season that doesn't work as brilliantly as that. In one given season in England, the correlation between a club's wages and its league position is only 70%, still pretty good, 70%. And the reason that correlation is weaker in 1 year is because in 1 year, luck matters. You know, the referee making a mistake, a ball that hits the post, your best player getting injured for a few weeks. But over a period of 10 years or so, all that luck evens out, and then really wages become the sole determinant. So one thing that this graph tells us is that the players who earn the most money really are the best players. And we know that in business or in politics, it's not like that. In soccer, success is real. In sport, generally, success is real. As Nick Hornby said, there are no bad 100-meter runners, but there are bad journalists and bad politicians. Okay, so sports journalism is more informed than other forms of journalism, and we're more honest than some forms. For example, in political journalism, often a journalist favors a political party or another. We don't really have that. Fans are often saying, well, you're a secret Manchester United fan or a secret Liverpool fan, but I believe that sports journalists generally try to say which players they think are good and which they think are bad in an honest way. So now I come to what we do wrong. And my basic argument today is that sports journalism has relied on magic, on magical thinking, and not on data of the kind that Stefan has. And I've just said that the great thing about sports is that you can judge it without spin. You don't need to hear what anybody says about the match. You saw the match, you can judge it. But nonetheless, we in the sports media are always asking coaches and players to give their spin on the match, which is completely unnecessary. And it's particularly strange that we listen to coaches' spin, because coaches, as these data suggest, have very little impact on results. It's the players who determine results. I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, the model that I think we should pursue more is, although American sports journalism is often very po-faced and humorless, it does actually use data. And so, for example, in basketball, they'll judge a player using a whole array of stats. So they'll say he's the 14th best rebounder or offensive rebounder in the NBA. And they'll have any number of stats on a player. In baseball, it turns out the key stat to judge a hitter, they've realized through a lot of trial and error, is on-base percentage, what percentage of times at bat he gets on base. And finally, in soccer, we're starting to get interesting numbers, both from off the pitch, about clubs' finances, and from on the pitch, about what players actually do on the field, that tell us interesting things about the game. But instead we ignore this data, or we look at the wrong data, and we let coaches tell the story of the game. I'm going to dwell on coaches just for a second, because to me they're the huge blind spot in European sports reporting. Now, if player salaries determine a team's results, then it hardly matters who the manager is. If Manchester United sack Alex Ferguson and they make me manager, or Declan, or a stuffed teddy bear, Manchester United will still be around the top of the table and might well win the league, because United pay top salaries, they have the best players, and the players are determinant, generally not the coach. And people say in response to this argument, yes, but what you're really measuring is also the coach's salary, because the teams with the best paid players also have the best paid coach. And so the best paid coaches are the best coaches, just as the best paid players are the best players. Now, in fact, this argument is wrong, because players are paid for their contribution to results, which is very easy to see. You know, every match, millions of people judge them on TV. And so you have millions of informed judges judging whether the player is good. What the manager does is harder to see, his contribution to results. And he's really more judged as a spokesman. The manager is the guy who comes out and tells the story of the club before the game and after the game. And so he has to look like the face of the club. So he has to be an ex-player, generally of a certain appearance, sort of a handsome, trim man in middle age is the typical thing. Helps if he was a great player. So if you're Roy Keane and you're a great player and you look like a manager, they give you a big job right away. And that's not really to do with any judgment of whether you have been a good manager, because when Keane got his first job, he'd obviously never been a manager, but got a big job, big salary. Whereas someone like Owen Coyle, who became a manager with, I think, initially Burnley, he didn't have that pedigree, he didn't have that CV, so he gets a small salary, but that doesn't mean that Roy Keane is a better coach than Owen Coyle. It doesn't mean that Diego Maradona is a better coach than all the Argentine coaches who were not chosen to manage Argentina in the World Cup. Maradona was chosen because he is what a coach is thought to be. He is a famous ex-player. Now, Stefan has worked out that about 10% of coaches do actually make a difference. About 10% do perform consistently better with their teams than the players' wage bill suggests they should. Those guys are above the line, if you like. And you're thinking about, I mean, some obvious names like Mourinho. He will perform better with his teams over time, not in just one season, but over time, than players' salaries would suggest. Brian Clough, Fabio Capello. When we did this measure for England, we found a couple of surprising names, like who would have thought that Tony Pulis of Stoke City was an overperformer, but he is. The other 90% of coaches, though, don't add value, they don't make a difference. But nonetheless, in sports journalism, we're obsessed with these guys. And I think it's because we in the media, we speak to the coach. He's the person from the club who comes out and talks to us. So because we see him and because he explains the result, we attribute power, we attribute agency to him, whereas he doesn't really have agency. So he comes out to the press conference after the game and he says, well, we won because of my brilliant tactics, team selection and psychology. Or he says, well, we lost because the blind referee gave a red card to our best player and it was never a foul. And then we write that in the articles. And really, what you read on the internet on Sunday night, in the paper on Monday morning, it's called a match report, but usually it's not a match report. It's a press conference report. We report what Alex Ferguson said in the press conference rather than how United played in the game is the typical way it works. So the manager spins the game and we report his spin as a favour to this guy who just doesn't matter. Then we come to players who, as I say, they do matter, they determine the results. And nonetheless, I think we spend too much time, we journalists, chasing them for quotes. And I've experienced this painfully over time, and now I stop chasing players for quotes because I'm too old, it's just too humiliating and stupid. I think in the 70s, when I wasn't doing this, player interviews were probably worthwhile because players actually often said what they thought. I mean, they weren't sort of micromanaged corporate men the way they are now. So you could sit down in the club canteen in the 1970s and chat to the guy and he'd talk to you like he was your mate. And very few journalists were doing this, so you could get good stuff. And that's all over now. Now all the big clubs have media departments, they often want to read the interview before it's published, and players learn never to say anything controversial. So players say boring things. I live in Paris, and the other week on French TV I saw Franck Ribéry talking. And it was just this amazing performance. He just rolled off cliches effortlessly without even trying. We played well, another big game coming, I hope we can win. The only thing that matters is the team performance. It was just masterful. And it was nothing. But to get that nothing from Ribéry takes many journalistic man-hours of chasing him. And I'm suggesting that we in journalism spend our man-hours more usefully now. Now, of course, we need players to be heroes. Sports media needs heroes because people follow sport usually not because they love tactics, but because they worship sportsmen usually as versions of the ideal men. They are the masculine ideals of today. people like David Beckham or Cristiano Ronaldo. And as Matthias Esterhazy just said, children don't want to be computer hackers, they want to be footballers. And so we need heroes, but I'm arguing that we don't need these heroes to speak. We don't need their quotes for them to be heroes. I mean, for example, let me just see if I can scroll this down accurately. David Beckham, the guy's never said an interesting sentence in his life, nor has Lionel Messi. I don't know if you can see some of these quotes from Beckham. My parents have always been there for me ever since I was about 7. Alex Ferguson is the best manager I've ever had at this level. Well, he's the only manager I've actually ever had at this level. Or that was in the past, we're in the future now. I could go on forever, but the point is, it's not really worth chasing David Beckham for quotes. It takes a hugely long time. And the same with Lionel Messi. He generally just says nothing at all. But still, they're heroes. I mean, they work for us. They sell the paper, usually with their pictures. And they get people watching football on TV. So I'd say let's stop chasing these people. Let's not spend that time and money, the little time and money that we in journalism have on that. Let's spend it on something else. And also chasing players, when you do catch them, it makes you less honest. Because to get access to a player, for him to speak to you a second time, you have to start telling lies about the player. You have to pretend he's better than he is. You can't criticize him in print or in speech on TV. And so you can end up pretending that the mediocre player who speaks to you is in fact a good player. So let's stop chasing coaches, let's stop chasing players, and let's spend what limited time and money we have on studying the wave of new data that's becoming available on sport. And I'll give some examples of data that we can use in the media, starting with sports business, because sports business is often extremely badly reported. And every newspaper needs a lady writing sports business who actually understands business. And I would suggest you should also cover match fixing. I say lady because part of our ridiculous magical belief system in sport is the notion that only men are qualified to write about sport. Example of bad sports business reporting was the bidding for the World Cups 2018, 2022. Every country bidding to host a tournament tells journalists, well, if we bring this tournament to Russia or England, it will create a lot of jobs and new infrastructure, and it will make the country richer with all the tourists coming in. People will see us on TV, and that will create foreign investment. This is all rubbish. And academic economists know this. They've been writing about the subject for about 25 years. Nonetheless, in the sports pages in the last few months, I regularly saw this rubbish from host committees reported as fact, and that's because the sports business reporter, A, didn't know, and B, wasn't speaking to academic economists who do know. Or take the constant reporting that a big football club's about to go out of business. It comes around every spring. Some club has high debts, and so the newspapers are saying it's about to disappear. It's going to stop existing. EPL's Portsmouth could go bust, says this headline. But you got similar reports in the last couple of years about Liverpool or even Real Madrid, because people say, well, Real Madrid have 500 million euros in debt. That's a lot of money. Can they repay that tomorrow morning? No, well then Real Madrid might disappear. Now, any study of football history shows that only very tiny clubs sometimes disappear, and all the rest are immortal. And they're immortal because the bank or the local government always steps in to save the club. You really don't want to be the bank manager who said to Liverpool, you can't pay, so I'm pulling the plug and I'm selling Anfield. So that never happens. If you look at the clubs in the English League in 1911, they're almost exactly the same as the clubs in the English League in 2011, and often they're in exactly the same division. So, in other words, these clubs have survived 2 world wars, recessions, crazed chairmen, hundreds of millions in debts, etc. They always exist. But nonetheless, a year ago, you got all these reports saying Portsmouth were about to go bust, and they were wrong at the time, and they were proved wrong, and it was just embarrassing and stupid, and we should stop being embarrassing and stupid. In American newspapers, the sports department used to be called the toy department, because it was children writing about childish things, and we really don't want to live up to the toy department tag. So we in the sports media, our basic problem is that we repeat these myths without ever testing them against data. And I say we need to replace magic with data. And I've talked about the off-field data we need to consult. But now, for the first time ever in football, and I'm talking particularly about football here, we have interesting data to judge performance on the field as well. About a decade ago, big clubs began collecting match data. And they'd count the number of passes each player made, the number of tackles, the number of kilometers he run. And for years, they took this data very seriously. And television still takes those data seriously. So if you watched the World Cup last year, at half-time, you'd see how many kilometers everybody had run, how many tackles they'd made. But that means that TV, we sports media, are still using data that clubs have by now discarded as being useless. Because most clubs now know you can't judge a defender by how many tackles he makes. And Paolo Maldini, he made one tackle every 2 games, I believe. So was Paolo Maldini a bad defender because he didn't tackle? I don't think so. Similarly, it's not really useful to know that somebody ran 13 kilometers if he was always running in the wrong direction, like a cartoon character. And you might have 100% completion rate on your passes, but that might be that you always were giving square balls in the center circle. Also not very useful. So clubs, after years of studying this data, have stopped studying this data. They realize, as people do in statistics, that you initially measure what you can measure, and then you take seriously what you can measure, even if it doesn't deserve that attention. And clubs are learning more about numbers now. Clubs are starting to abandon magic, which is another reason that we should abandon magic. And they're finally finding statistics that do reveal something. So recently I visited Manchester City, and they have this huge sort of performance department of people looking at match data. And they'd studied about 400 corner kicks in different leagues. And they found the type of corner that produces most goals is the in-swinging corners to the near post. Because everybody crowds in and the keeper might pass it away, but it's near the goal line, somebody slides it in. It's much more productive than the outswinger. But nonetheless, these managers steeped in football often think the outswinger works best. In fact, if you saw Manchester City play Manchester United recently, City's corners were all outswingers against their own statistical advice. Johan Cruyff, a great Dutch thinker on football, believes the outswinger is the most effective corner. Well, not according to this particular statistical study. Or there's a professor at the London School of Economics who's done some research on the Spanish league about free kicks. And you know what typically happens at a free kick is the team's main man, the number 10 usually, gets the ball, he puts it down, waves everyone away, walks back, runs in, and he blasts it over the bar. And that is the norm in free kicks. Of course, every now and then a ball sails into the top corner, and we all have that in our minds from TV replays, but typically free kicks are wasted. And they're blasted at goal and they miss. And this Spanish economist, Ignacio Palacios Huerta, comparing indirect free kicks to direct free kicks, says clubs would do better on the whole if they passed the free kick. Imagine you get the ball 20 yards from goal, none of the opposition players is allowed within, I think, 9 meters of the ball. So you put the ball down and you say to the opposition, maybe I'm going to shoot, maybe I'm going to pass. And you have 4 or 5 runners placed, and the other team has to mark those, making your shot more, if you choose to shoot, more productive, etc. But clubs never do that. They have this tradition that they shoot free kicks at goal. And so this is another way that data is going to change soccer and that we in the media need to notice. One last stat that I found very interesting. I recently did a tour of sort of performance directors talking about match data in clubs, listening to them talk. And this performance director at a very big Premier League club told me he'd found the stat for value in keepers. It always was hard to know what made a good keeper, but he says, you can't really judge a keeper on the percentage of shots he stops, because what if he has a great defense and the shots are all coming from 25, 30 meters? It's easy to stop those shots. But he says if you judge all keepers on how many shots they stop from, percentage of shots they stop from inside the penalty area, that's interesting. And then you might find keeper X, he has this amazing stop percentage. Keeper Y, his stop percentage has declined in recent years. That's interesting. So that is one of those stats that we in the media need to start paying attention to. And this club uses this stat to scout and evaluate goalkeepers. So my point is, there are more and more interesting data from on and off the field, and we journalists need to use them. We must stop believing the magic of coaches, stop chasing idiotic players for idiotic quotes. Replace magic with data, but always remain skeptical of the data. And then sports journalism is going to be more accurate, more revealing, and maybe even more fun. Thanks very much.
There was a great goalkeeper from the Cameroons called Joseph Antoine Bell. He was I think he was actually even the captain of the Cameroonian team during the 1994 World Cup. And played in France for much of his career. A great philosopher. He's on French television commentating on football now. And they were once giving him the business because, as you know, a lot of West African teams are consumed with juju, witch doctors, superstition, fetishes. And so somebody came up and, was basically giving him the runaround on this stuff. And Joseph Antoine Bell just kind of nodded and went, yeah, it's true in West Africa we have witch doctors. And in Europe, you have statistics. That's not a reflection on Simon's thing. It was just made me think of that with all and if you've ever seen the use of statistics in North America sports departments, it too has become another section of fetishism magic. This session now is specifically for the journalists. I put it out there more as a talking point, where it's the end of the afternoon. It's an end of a 3-day session, 2.5-day session. I want to really open up the challenges that Simon talked about. How are we doing our profession, and how are we doing it well? I think we've only got Raphael, our colleague from Latvia, Jan, Nick, our colleagues from Hungary. Are there any, Marcus from the Netherlands, Jens Seger Andersen, our colleague from El Marca? Yes, hang on, we have got enough journalists. Our Romanian colleague, we can do this. I thought we were doing this. So can I just open up the discussion as to what do we do well? What are the things that we do well? Jens?
Do I have to answer that question?
No, not at all. This is a discussion on the state of journalism.
Just give my wholehearted support to Simon for suggesting that
Please.
Journalists use data. In general, journalists are very timid of approaching academics, but they should do more often. Not all academics are good or interesting. Some are. If you approach only those academics and the academic reports that are highlighted by the sports organizations, you may get into some traps. But approach somebody, go to the universities, go to their conferences. I will not mention play the game in this context. My modesty prohibits that.
Is that the conference in Cologne, October 3rd to 6th of 2010?
We can discuss that later. Yes. No, but I mean, this is actually one of the outcomes is that when you network with academics, academics learn that journalists are not all cannibals that are only out to devour their sources and expose them in big crushing headlines. And journalists learn also that academics are not all in the tower of ivory. But there's also another thing that journalists should do sometimes, just basic fact-checking. For instance, there's been a big issue in London where the Olympian Stadium legacy has been discussed. Was it Tottenham or West Ham that should take over? Big story. The whole premise for the debate was that England would look bad in the eyes of the Olympic international community if they did not safeguard an athletic stadium. Now, this promise was never made. This promise was never made. When England, it is like referring to a promise that was never made. It would be quite simple for journalists to establish that fact instead of following a debate that is running along the wrong track. Another promise, however, was made, and that was to mobilize 2 million UK citizens for grassroots sport. Now, grassroots sport has been cut consistently since the Olympics came to London, among other things, to finance the Olympics. That's a good journalistic story.
Nick.
I was just going to say I agree completely with everything Simon said, and I agree with him wholeheartedly. And I don't think, as journalists, any of us would argue with the point that we all want to engage in intelligent, fact-based journalism, less he said, she said journalism, and more facts and that kind of stuff. The problem, though, is that we all work for organisations and individual editors who basically tell us what they want because that's what they perceive the readers want. And it's actually quite difficult in the mainstream media to move away from, and I'm not talking about my particular employer now or any single employer, but if you're working, for example, for the Sun newspaper or any newspaper, you know, the agenda is not being set by us as the journalists, and that is a very difficult thing to change. You asked me earlier about, you know, why I hadn't gone to China and done that thing. Well, that's because I've never worked for an organisation that would pay for me to go to China for 6 months and do the kind of work that you did. That's why I haven't done it, because I could never fund that, and I wouldn't find an employer who would either. And I mentioned this to Simon outside. He said the FT wouldn't do that, probably because they wouldn't print it, because for legal reasons, you know, later on. That, I think, is the problem, more than the journalists' willingness to do it.
I mean, I absolutely... Does this microphone even work?
Yes.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Nick that it goes to editorial level as well, and different newspapers, the editors have more or less power and the journalists more or less. So both editors and journalists need to change. I totally agree. But we journalists also need to believe that what we're doing is wrong when we're hanging around the training ground at some... I've seen at Lazio Roma, you know, 40 journalists are there every single morning waiting for the players like this, and it's a terrible life and it's completely useless. It's not performing a public service.
Thank you very much for everything you have said.
Sultan, you go ahead and get the mic.
Okay, excuse me. Thank you very much for what you have said here, and for Nick, for you, Jens, because actually this is what I'm doing at the Money Channel every day, and so that I'm not so lonely in this world full of bags and so on. This is why I'm so happy being here with you every time. What do you think that we can have this kind of topics being more creative as a business journalist, but not only as a business journalist with topics related to sports? Is the first question. And another one, I don't think we'll have a salary cap in Europe, and if you'll have this kind of salary cap, will be the same like in the States, or will be something related to the European model of sport, with a salary cap for the first division, the second one, the third one, and so on.
Your first question was about, can we have this policy in newspapers?
Yes. Can we have that kind of topics being more creative? Yeah. Not so specific to stats and to numbers and so on.
I'll answer your second question first, the salary cap. I try not to spend any time thinking about things that will never happen, and so I don't think much about salary caps because they will never happen. There will not be an effective enforced salary cap in European football. And so there's not really much point talking about what form it will take. It's not going to happen. And secondly, about can this be done? Yes, of course it can be done. I mean, lots of really clever journalists out there. And imagine all the time you'd free up if people didn't have to travel to the press conference. I'm amazed at press conferences. I mean, you get a room like this, but completely full, unlike for me. 150 journalists, 5 camera crews, filming the manager talking about tomorrow's match, or talking about yesterday's match. Nothing intelligent is said, and it's all over the news tomorrow. Now, if you cut all those expenses, or you just sent one journalist to record the manager's thinking, and then release it to the rest of the media, you could do all this stuff that I'm talking about, no problem.
Can I ask a controversial question?
No. Okay. Go ahead.
We're talking about veneration of athletes in this world that's going on. Is it latent homosexuality that drives this, or is it false religion? Like, I read these descriptions of these athletes, usually written by and for men. Not all of this is sexual in nature, but there's some stuff that I'm like, what?
Yeah,
what is this?
Can I try and answer? I think that each society has its version of the ideal man. So 100 years ago in Europe, it would, I think, very much have been the soldier. He was the ideal of masculinity, which means that he is what women want and what men want to be. And so now that is the athlete, usually the footballer in Europe. He is what women want and what men want to be. Not all women and not all men, but he is the societally agreed version of masculine perfection. And so that's why you get that kind of writing. And also when a player transgresses, he does badly, like Cristiano Ronaldo, he dives, he complains, he whinges, and the English media attack him for that. They're also debating what an ideal man is. They're saying Cristiano Ronaldo, as a great footballer, should be the ideal man, but in fact he's not the ideal man, and that helps us clarify who is the ideal man.
Are there other suggestions about what we do as sports journalists well? Marcus.
Yeah, I just want to comment on what Nick was saying. What we shouldn't forget is that we don't only have bosses who are telling us what we should write about because they say that's what the reader is willing to read. We also have to do with deadlines, and in Holland the deadlines are getting earlier and earlier every year. That is because it's cheaper to print the newspaper earlier, so there is less printing costs. It takes less time to deliver the newspaper. That's how it works in Holland. So what you get then is that the Champions League matches that end like 10:30, 10:45 or something, it's really hard to write a good story about that because there is not even time to reflect about it. It's just, describing what you see. And even in the last 10 minutes, your newspaper will be calling you to put some pressure on you, like, can you please send a story if you have an idea what this match will end like? They even suggest it's not necessary to wait the final whistle or something. It's not, everything, every measure you can save money with as a newspaper is a way to put pressure on your journalists because they want to keep their job. So if they can save money by delivering their articles earlier, then it's for their own benefits. So I just want to make that point because in Holland that is a serious discussion now.
Can I try and... Sorry, I won't respond to everything. I'll let other people speak. But briefly, your point is exactly why we need to rethink how we spend our very limited time and money. You're right. The amount of time and money we have to do journalism gets smaller and smaller all the time. So then you must say, is it a useful expenditure of that time and money for 100 journalists to go to a press conference of a manager who doesn't matter?
And all write effectively the same story.
And they all come away and write versions of the same story, yeah.
How many of our colleagues are stupid, do you think, Marcus? Like,
From my newspaper, or?
yeah, I mean, from your direct, because the paradigm that Nick's sketched for us is we're serfs working for the evil empire. But I'm saying, well, but how many of, okay, let's go along with that, but how many of us are genuinely stupid in your experience?
I think we're all a bit stupid because if we would have been really smart, we would have not been doing these jobs. So, but maybe the bosses are smarter. Maybe the bosses are stupid. I don't know. What I do know is that this is a good job to do because you have the ability, the possibility to maybe touch even the athletes if you would like to. It's not my point of view, but to be in the kitchen when the fire is on, it's tense. It's great to visit all these great games and talk to people other people normally only see on TV. But it's getting less and less. I should say, it's not like it was. I'm not an old man, I'm only 27 years old, but I work for the Volkskrant now for 7 years in a row, and I can see the differences. If you compare now to 7 years ago, then it was like, come on, take your time, no problem. If you can deliver a story for tomorrow, then do it for maybe next week. I suggested in my own time investigating one of the Dutch cycling teams. There are some things really going wrong there now. I told my boss, I will do that. My boss told me, okay, no problem. Just take a week off, don't publish any other articles, investigate. A week, if that's enough, it's okay. If it's not enough, take another week. 2 days later, I got a call. Yeah, we have a problem here because we have a hole in the page. Can you just do an article on doping or this or that? Just to fill the hole. You know what I mean? Investigating is hard with all the pressure on your shoulders, especially the economical, the financial deadlines my boss has to fulfill.
And can I just add one irony of the internet age, where supposedly there's more and more information, is that never have we had so much of the same information recycled endlessly. And actually, I think the media is becoming less diverse. And one of the reasons for this is because we all live in a 24-hour news cycle. I write for a newspaper, and fortunately, I'm not called upon to file daily for that because it's a Sunday newspaper. But when I worked in daily newspapers, you're actually filing for the internet increasingly before the newspaper. The Guardian, for example, now, the priority is actually the website ahead of the actual paper. So we're living in a cycle where there's more and more demands on just a normal, typical journalist time to produce more and more stories and spend less and less time on individual stories. Therefore, you're getting what's been termed journalism by the Guardian journalist Nick Davis, who wrote a book called Flat Earth News, which I'd recommend anybody read to give you a small insight into British journalism. And the idea of journalism, that you're getting more and more stories across all sectors of the paper generated by PR, by surveys, by people copying and pasting stuff. Very few checks. Again, I'm not absolving responsibility for journalists. What I did when I felt I wasn't able to do the kind of journalism I wanted to do, I set up a website and I do that kind of investigative stuff there. But, I accept that most people haven't, you don't have time to do it. And I think less and less time is spent, on stories, basically. It's not a very original point.
Yeah. No, Flat Earth News is brilliant.
Well, I must say I'm getting a bit nervous about this discussion, because I think, I'm Jan Houspie, Belgian journalist, magazine. I'm getting a bit nervous because I think we're the wrong public for the wrong audience for this message. I think we all agree on what Simon said. I recognize the stories of my friends over there. I don't have the feeling this helps me. I know all this, and we all know. So the question is, can we change it? I don't think so. The only thing we can do is go on the way we are working already. So this is useless, I think, what we are saying now. We all know.
So should we just go to the bar?
No.
No, I mean...
we preach. I don't know how you say it in English, but in Dutch there's a
preaching to our own parishioners, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But I mean, I would say that, to revert to my particular argument about quotes and managers and players...
But I agree completely.
Yes, but I don't think that is... I might be wrong. I don't think that is a widely held consensual belief in the media. I might be wrong, but my impression is that it's not.
True, but it is here. It is here in this room.
Great, yeah, brilliant.
I think there's a consensus about that in this room. I don't chase footballers for quotes for many years already. So, I don't know whether there are players, journalists in this room who chase players for quotes. I don't think so. We're doing different things, and the only thing we can do is keep on working like that, but it won't change others unless we're editor, hoofdredacteur, chief editor of a magazine or a paper ourselves. Maybe we can change the way of working in papers or magazines. But I'm not a chief editor, so I have to do what they ask me to do. But I can follow my own agenda also. So that's it.
So I take it from the implied question in your comment is, what can we do? There's nothing we can do.
Well, no, the only thing what I wanted to say is this discussion doesn't help me, is my feeling.
Okay, yeah. So can I take that question and ask the rest of the room? Like, is there anything that we can do? Because we could just knock off and go have a beer. Shouldn't put that in the center.
Yes, I think
Everybody wants the beer rather than...
we all agree with Simon.
Ferenc.
I just want to say, you guys, most of you come from a great football power country, and when you have a press conference, there is 150 guys waiting for the interview, and they have the same story, different versions. As we in Hungary are in the lucky situation that when there is a press conference, there is only 4 or 5 cameramen and reporters. And after the press conference, we can have a one-on-one interview. And no matter how idiot the coach or the player is, you can always get unique information from there. So if you have a one-on-one interview, you can always do something which is unique and just for your medium.
What's the difference between English sports and Hungarian sports? Is it all just a question of money? Like, why is it different here?
I would say yes, money. An organization which always comes from money as well. So the quality of sport, but that comes from money. Yeah, we have Olympic sports we are very good at, but those are probably the ones that don't require too much money. Or people, they are not so popular, not spectacular sports. Who watches water polo? I mean, even, only at the Olympics. But you can't broadcast it because it's underwater. So there is nothing you can see.
There is a case, I was supposed to be broadcasting.
Sorry, no, just, I don't know if one of you... No, there was just one story, I think it was about Zoltan Gera, or that it was easier to talk to him before he went to England to play there in the Premier League. So it's just that, I mean, because 2 years ago was the under-21, if I'm not wrong, in Sweden. And then was England playing there, of course, some English journalists, all papers were there, and the players didn't stop. There was a press officer taking them like, to walk out. They were not supposed to. They were 19-year-old, 18-year-old. So, I mean, if that's the culture there in England, well, okay, I mean, it's a problem for all journalists there. But the problem is that it's becoming a culture for other countries. I mean, players getting there. Hungarians, Bulgarians, Brazilians, Argentinians, they go there and they get used to, okay, now we don't have to talk to the guys anymore. So I don't know. I mean, of course, it has to do with maybe image rights, but even in, I don't know, consequences in the national team, because it shouldn't be the same way as, I mean, I understand the Premier League matches are different, but yeah, it's just that, I mean, there's a new generation of players getting used to it, that they don't have to. They don't have to speak. And sometimes you can get interesting stories from players. Not all of them, or sometimes, I mean, you get a very nice story from that player that you go to, you know, as the reserve right back, and then your boss will say, okay, yeah, reserve left back or right back, yeah, okay, no to Walcott, okay, we'll see about that. So I don't know, yeah, it's a bit more of the same. It's a bit frustrating, but the same way I think about the English league is that the power that it has on football, it might have consequences even in the way that athletes behave or talk to the press. I think it's happening already.
It's not that I want to be negative. I want to say something positive as well. Maybe what I'm thinking now, after hearing all this, well, I don't have the feeling this makes me better. What might make me better is to hear from all of you how you work, how you got your stories, to learn from it, where I can find the stories, how I should work, you know? Yeah, I'm very curious about for instance, Nick, he told me that he's already 15 years working on matchfixing. I don't know which stories he made, but I want to know how he found them. Well, it would lead us too far now to maybe to expand on that, but specific stories, explain them for an audience of journalists who do the same things, try to do the same things. That would make us all better. But not now. I have the feeling we're complaining about how difficult it is to do what we want to do in modern media.
Although I think Simon began this conversation mapping out a new way of approaching sports journalism. Abandon chasing players, fixate on actual data that's coming out of the games. Like, look at the games in a new particular way. Look at this in a new thing. See what we can measure. Is that
From inside the game, from on the field and from off the field. So use data about finances and economics to explain sport in a large way, rather than we won because the manager's a genius. So away from magic towards data. Yeah.
Nick, do you want to talk a bit about your thing, and then let's wrap up and have this over beers?
Well, I'm happy to. I don't know. I mean, what
Mr. Farr now?
particular stories? A particular story? Or I mean, there's the story that Declan has mentioned a number of times. There was a particular story, which was where I was looking at the idea of gambling in sport, in professional sport, amongst professional sportsmen, and how there was a growing body of evidence that there was a gambling problem, particularly in the last decade since internet gambling has become accessible. Footballers have always gambled. It's a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true in terms of the footballer. So this was, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago when I was looking at the issue of addiction to gambling amongst professional footballers in England and how the authorities were or weren't tackling that problem, including treatment at Sporting Chance and other clinics where the players were being educated. That's while I was looking at the subject of a gambling addiction, I came across the story of a footballer who had basically got himself sent off to repay. Basically got in a, it was got sent off deliberately for betting purposes, and that was one story. There's match-fixing stories. The type of match-fixing stuff that I've written about in England is deeply unglamorous, lower division, non-league football. And again, most of the starting points is there is either somebody involved in the scenario or quite often somebody involved in the betting. It starts with the betting, and then I follow the story from the betting, and then through the investigatory authorities, through sources at the Football Association and the Gambling Commission and the bookmakers, people who are investigating it to try and put the stories together. But these are not sexy stories. They're very difficult stories to sell to editors, because if you're dealing with a lower league football match that, trying to get that in the paper, get it in once, fine, but this is, again, something as an industry I think we're bad at following up, and keeping readers informed, staying with a narrative. But editors want to have a story, and then if you go back to them 2 weeks later and say, I want to update you on what's happening with that, often they'll say, we did that a fortnight ago. I think we're bad at that as an industry as well. So in terms of match-fixing stories, all kinds of different sources, different betting. I mean, the betting, start with the money, follow the money. That's in terms of match-fixing stuff. And again, I've done quite a lot of stuff in snooker, tennis. Everyone knows that tennis had a massive problem potentially a few years ago. And again, it was following the money. It was going to the bookmakers and industry sources, the investigators themselves, the players. But I mean, this is, I'm quite happy to chat and give you a bit more details, but I think this is a bit boring probably for the rest of you.
No, I don't think it is, but Matthias?
Thank you. Two things. Simon said that, leave the coaches, leave the players. But I heard it numerous times that workmate, editor, or reader, someone told me that we want to read about the stars, we want to read what they said, the biggest players. That's what the readers want. Do we even know what the readers want? Because sometimes I have not really an idea.
Well, I mean, I use the counterexample of David Beckham. I mean, by all means, write about David Beckham, write about Lionel Messi. Speak to people around them. Why is Messi so brilliant? What is this about this being able to stand up immediately when everybody else has fallen down after the ball rebounds? A physical coach close to him who can analyse what makes his physique so unusual. But you don't need to chase the players themselves, because the amount of time you spend versus the reward you get is tiny. Write about Beckham, write about Messi, but they don't have to speak. It's like Charlie Chaplin or Marilyn Monroe. They were stars, but they didn't have to speak. And it's the same, I would say, with most footballers.
Thanks. And the other thing, which I think is a huge task, not just for our newspapers, that Nemzeti Sport is a Hungarian daily sport paper, and we also have an online edition. And I think it's a big problem which information to share, which information to use, what style can the online edition use and what the print edition use, and it's really hard to find a good balance between the two editions, I think, and it's a really big problem, I think, for the future. I think slowly the print version is like losing readers, but you have to do something. It's like you just can't say, yeah, okay, we will lose these readers eventually. So I don't know if anybody has any ideas or views about this, about the print and the online journalism, the connections.
Sorry, I was still thinking of Jan's statement and Nick's earlier statement. My sense of it is, it's journalism because now we're twittering and blogging at the same time as we're doing our journalism. But look, for the fix, the way I got to the Black Stars was I just went to Ghana. Like, it's really difficult to chase people outside their dressing room. But most of the top leagues in Europe, many of their players aren't from that country. So just go visit them on their summer holidays. It becomes much easier to speak to them that way. Is it going to be difficult to sell your editor for a week-long trip somewhere else? Yeah, but use your imagination to figure out other stories that might be there. But it was remarkably easy to speak to all of the Black Stars. I only put a selection of them in the actual book, but I spoke to everyone on that team. And so that was much easier than going through their football clubs in Italy or Germany or wherever they were playing. I'll give the last comment to Simon, and then let's break for the bar, because I think it's late. We've done 2.5 days of work, and it's time to wrap it up, unless there's other strongly urgent comments to do.
Just briefly, of course there's huge constraints. Of course it's a really difficult time. Of course you have to file 5 times a day. Those are givens. We're not going to change that. I mean, we have a business model that doesn't work, and everybody's frantically trying to find one that does. What I'm saying is, given these problems, given these constraints, how can we do the best journalism that we possibly can? So I think that's more useful. I agree with Jan. I think that's a more useful question to pursue than I wish we didn't have these constraints.